I love that there is a debate between one of my favorite counter-apologists and one of the world's derpiest apologists. This time, Bart Ehrman and Dinesh D'Souza debate the problem of evil. Ehrman anticipates the explanation that a lot of apologists give, that evil is the result of human free will. We shouldn't complain about evil and suffering because the only way they wouldn't exist is if humans were robots with no free will.
I came to realize that there are problems with this robot explanation. For one thing, it's an incomplete explanation that doesn't solve the problem of why they're suffering. You all will remember a tsunami that killed 300,000 people. Whose free will caused that?
How are natural disasters caused by free will? The robot argument doesn't address this.
Most people I know who think that, who have the explanation that it's all because of free will, most people I know who advance that idea are themselves Christians. These are people who believe that when they die, they're going to go to heaven. They also believe that there will be no suffering in heaven. And so one might ask, will there be free will in heaven? If there's free will in heaven, but no suffering in heaven, that must mean that it is possible to have a world with free will, but without suffering. So why don't we have a world with free will without suffering? Well, it obviously wasn't set up that way, but it means that the free will explanation doesn't really explain the problem.
If we have free will in heaven, then free will does not mean that suffering and evil are inevitable. However, Alvin Plantinga has hypothesized that maybe there is no free will in heaven. Those who say that it is good that we have free will because otherwise we would be robots, imply that it is for some reason not desirable to be a robot. So if there's no free will in heaven, then either being a robot isn't really that bad, or being in heaven isn't really that great.
So the first problem we have, I think, as not just Christians, but as thinking people is, what position are we in to judge the architecture of the universe?
I hear this shit from apologists all the time. I call this the Jenny Jones defense. Because if Yahweh were to defend himself with this argument, it would be like he's saying, "You don't know me." You don't know Yahweh, you can all kiss my ass. This argument is a cop-out. It's an argument against even trying to think critically about the things we are told about Yahweh. It boils down to saying, if anything about Yahweh seems immoral to you, if anything makes you skeptical about the claim that he is omnibenevolent, just assume that it's because you're stupid rather than expecting a rational explanation. This is a dodge. It's an evasion.
And so here we are, human beings. We are part of the universe. And we are second-guessing the blueprint of the entire universe. So my first question is, are we really in full possession of adequate facts to be able to say, we think God could have done better?
D'Souza seems to believe that, in fact, a God could not have done better. His God is supposedly omnipotent. If he's omnipotent, it's a contradiction to say that he couldn't have done better than create such an imperfect universe.
It is a fact that if you are going to have free will, you're going to have to choose between right and wrong, between good and evil. To remove free will is to remove that ability to choose. It isn't necessarily to make us robots, but it is in some sense to make us inhuman. In fact, what do we call people who don't have the ability to choose right from wrong? We call them psychopaths or sociopaths.
No, we fucking don't. Psychopathy and sociopathy are not defined as the inability to choose between right and wrong or good and evil. It's the inability to empathize, which makes psychopaths unable to care about the morality or immorality of their actions. Suppose a person had no ability to choose between good and evil because they had such strong empathy that they were psychologically incapable of choosing evil. Such a person would be the exact opposite of a psychopath. D'Souza seems to think that such a person is somehow inhuman, but if only ever being able to do what is best without ever even being tempted to do anything wrong is inhuman, then to hell with being human. Why would anyone prefer to be human?
I'll come back and talk about the issue of free will in heaven, but in general, the argument that moral evil can be explained as a result of God creating us in his image, which is to say free like him, in some senses co-creators of circumstances in the universe. And that allows us to do some terrible things to each other.
We're told that Yahweh is the greatest conceivable being. If we are free like him, that would mean that Yahweh is free to do evil, just as we are. It would mean that Yahweh doing evil is conceivable. If you can conceive of a being doing evil, then such a being is not the greatest conceivable being.
But then Bart rightly says that that's not the end of the story, because you do have terrible things that happen that human beings had nothing to do with. Tsunamis, hurricanes, natural suffering that seems to come out of, you might say, the laws of nature. And in some ways, Bart says if God is omnipotent, he could intervene. In fact, you might raise the question, why have laws of nature in the first place? No laws of nature, no hurricanes, no tsunamis, no earthquakes. Why did God create a lawful universe? Actually, there are some people who think he didn't. The Muslim scholar Al-Ghazali says there are no laws. God intervenes at every second to make things happen as they do. In some senses, the alternative to a lawful universe is, you might say, a discretionary universe. Everything happens because God wills it. And it doesn't have to happen the same way twice. So if you drop a pen, it goes to the ground, but the next time you drop it, it goes right up. That would be a whimsical universe, unpredictable. Now, try to think about this, because Bart said, free will cannot be used to defend against natural evil. I insist that it can. Because in a whimsical universe, human action would have no predictable consequence. If I were to pull out a gun to shoot you, God could block the bullet.
Yes, but doing that would stop human evil. That's not the same as intervening to stop a natural disaster. If Yahweh wants us to act freely and he wants our actions to have consequences, how is that in any way undermined by intervening to prevent suffering only in cases that are not consequences of human action? How does intervening to stop an earthquake prevent human actions from having consequences?
But to my understanding, these miracles, by and large, are aimed at, you might say, spiritual benefits, and not to contravene the laws of nature for their own sake. In other words, God parts the Red Sea for the Israelites to cross. Jesus heals the blind man, but he doesn't heal blindness. The purpose is conversion. It's spiritual. There is a contravention of a law of nature, but it's occasional. It's rare, and it's done for a spiritual purpose.
How was parting the Red Sea done for the purpose of conversion? Whom was he trying to convert? Did the Israelites not already believe in Yahweh? Was he trying to convert the Egyptians? If miracles are just for the purpose of conversion, then why doesn't he pull off one big worldwide miracle that converts everyone? Why create a miracle that, for example, is invisible to everyone except the people within a few kilometers of Fatima, Portugal? Again, you may use the cop-out that I don't know enough to question the intentions of Yahweh, but then you're really just giving up on trying to give a rational explanation of what those intentions actually are. And why would a loving God only intervene for spiritual purposes rather than to prevent thousands of deaths?
Why do we have earthquakes? The reason we have earthquakes, and by the way, this is not an argument from the Bible, this is an argument from geology. The reason we have earthquakes is underneath the earth are massive tectonic plates that move. And these tectonic plates, it turns out, are absolute prerequisites for life on Earth to exist.
So your supposedly omnipotent God can't create or sustain life without tectonic plates? If he's really omnipotent, why couldn't he just speak us into existence, which is how we are told he created the universe, instead of relying on an evolutionary process that requires all of these precisely calibrated settings? D'Souza goes on to make the fine-tuning argument, which is pretty tangential to the topic at hand. Also, it doesn't answer the challenge of why suffering exists. Even if it were the case that this all-powerful God somehow doesn't have the power to create life without permitting earthquakes, why can't this God create humans that are earthquake-proof? Why did he make cockroaches and tardigrades so good at surviving harsh conditions, but not humans? I suppose it's because he can't for some reason. Some reason that we're supposed to believe somehow avoids contradicting the idea that he's all-powerful.
You mean God could not create a world without tectonic plates? There have to be tsunamis that kill 300,000 people? Really? There have to be? You're telling me that God couldn't do something different? God couldn't dream up a world without tectonic plates? How limited is God? Is God so limited that he could not create a world without earthquakes and hurricanes and tsunamis and droughts. Is that really the case that God couldn't do it? If that's what you think, then I would say you're probably leaning more toward my direction. I don't believe that, in fact, there could be a God who causes suffering or allows suffering if he could prevent it. And I don't believe if there was an all-powerful God in the world that, in fact, you could say that he can't prevent it.
Modern science shows that this universe cannot function with other laws. That if you had other laws, you wouldn't get Homo sapiens at the end of it. So yes, God could have made other laws, but you'd get a different kind of creature at the end of the process. So if God wanted to use a lawful process and wanted to create creatures like us, modern science tells us that this is the recipe. The laws that exist here and now are the necessary prerequisite for us being here. Now, these laws are in some senses double-edged. The sunshine that makes life possible is also the sunshine that gives us wrinkles and sometimes exposes us to radiation, cancer. The water that we drink without which we couldn't have life, well, you can drown in it. And so these laws are of such a kind that they can by themselves impose hardship, impose suffering. But here's the other side of it. God has at the same time given us the tools to comprehend these laws and in some ways to overcome them. That is called modern science.
No, nobody gave us these tools. We invented these tools. You don't get to give Yahweh the credit for science, especially given the fact that his self-appointed representatives in the church have tried to stand in the way of science whenever it shows that a biblical understanding of the world is contrary to demonstrable facts.
God squashes Job under his mighty thumb, and Job writhes on the ground in dust and ashes and repents for even asking. Is that what we should do in the face of the big questions that we have to ask? Should we writhe on the ground and say, well, I'm not going to ask the question because it's too deep for me to understand? Should we admit that we can't know and so we're not going to ask? I don't think so.
Even if there is a God, saying that we are in no position to ask questions like these is effectively to say, shut up and stop thinking.
Let's say that someone suffers horribly for 50 years, but is living in eternity in bliss. Has God wronged such a person?
Yes, of course. If a God is capable of giving that person an eternity of bliss without the 50 years of suffering, then I see it as perfectly reasonable to say that this God has wronged that person.
What was happening in the Garden of Eden? Basically, the Garden of Eden was a place, a sphere, a dimension, if you will, under God's direction. And yeah, there were no laws. Everything worked well. Perhaps E was not equal to MC squared in the Garden of Eden. I don't know.
Has D'Souza already forgotten that just 10 minutes prior he said this?
If you had other laws, you wouldn't get Homo sapiens at the end of it.
Then how the fuck did he get Homo sapiens in the Garden of Eden where there supposedly are no laws? Holy fuck, what a shithead.
But the idea was that God, in a sense, offers human beings a choice. Live under God's direction. You can call that the discretionary universe. Our will is subordinated in all things to God's will. And so are the laws of nature. So is whatever laws operate in Eden. God controls it all. No rotten trees, no fruit that fall and turn bad. Now the message of the fall is that human beings rejected that world. Not just Adam and Eve, because I believe we would reject it again if we were given a chance. Our free will inclines us to say, no, we do not want to live under God's world. We want to make our own world. And that means we want to live under our will and do things the way we see fit and manipulate the universe and the earth in the way that we deem best, not God.
When I read Genesis, I do not at all get the impression that Adam and Eve had much understanding of what the consequences of their actions would be. In fact, they ate from the tree because the snake lied to them about what those consequences would be. They were deceived into disobeying Yahweh. But let's say it's the case that humans really chose the fallen world over Eden and that we would choose it again. If this is true, Eden must be a really shitty place. And if living in such a discretionary universe is not preferable to living on Earth, then why should any of us look forward to heaven? Wouldn't heaven also be this kind of discretionary universe?
God gave us as a sort of a trial period to decide if we want to live in that other world, always available to us, in which we operate constantly and unremittingly under God's authority and God's will. That to me is the meaning of the fall. The two choices put before us as human beings, and it wasn't just Adam and Eve, but I believe all of us in this room, if made to choose again, would choose exactly what Adam and Eve chose.
Then why would any of us ever want to go to heaven? If every one of us, including presumably Dinesh himself, would prefer to live a life in which we make our own decisions, then why would salvation be at all desirable if it means being under the total control of a god? An argument that D'Souza made about the origin of evil is that at least some evil is unique to human beings and not found in the rest of the animal kingdom. He says that animals only kill other animals for food or defense, but no animals are capable of being so sadistic as to attempt to wipe out an entire other species. Bart Ehrman's response was that sadism is not at all unique to humans. Animals sometimes hunt for sport and will even torture their prey by inflicting far more suffering upon them than is necessary for obtaining food or defending themselves. Cats will sometimes do this to mice, for example. Here's D'Souza's weird rebuttal.
The mouse who is being tortured by your cat is not being tortured in any sense that we mean the word torture. If someone is torturing me by playfully tossing me up and down with a big bayonet waiting for me to land on it, the reason I'm being tortured is that I can anticipate death. I can see it. I can imagine it. I have the cognitive faculties to apprehend it, and therein lies the torture. The torture is that I'm being playfully dangled before I'm going to be killed in a manner that I can anticipate.
So inflicting pain and suffering upon someone is only torture if the victim anticipates that the torture will result in death? What the fuck is wrong with you, D'Souza? Do you seriously believe that if someone inflicts severe pain upon you in a manner that is not life-threatening, that isn't torture? What fucking planet are you from?
And in the example that you give, the anticipation is necessary for the torture to make sense. Otherwise, if the cat is dangling the mouse and the mouse feels nothing except I'm being dangled up and down, there is no torture.
Why the fuck would the mouse feel nothing? I'm thinking D'Souza misunderstands the analogy. When Ehrman talks about a cat torturing a mouse, he's not talking about the cat merely threatening the mouse with death. He's talking about the cat inflicting pain upon the mouse. But even if the cat were not inflicting physical pain upon the mouse, a mouse that's being dangled by a cat is certainly going to be suffering because of the fear it would feel. It may not have a mind sophisticated enough to understand and anticipate death, but it would still feel fear, and that feeling would probably be very unpleasant. It would still be torture. Holy fuck, this guy's a shithead.
Does the child who is thrown on the bayonet know that he's going to die?
No. But in that case, the evil is in the intention of the person doing it. And in this case, the question is whether the cat dangling the mouse is itself engaging in torture in the same way that the Nazis did when they treated the Jews in the way they did. Okay, let's talk about hell.
I think that maybe this is the point at which D'Souza realized he wasn't making the tiniest bit of sense.